He served 3 years in prison for embezzling $847,000 from his company. His wife testified against him. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was considered a textbook white-collar crime, except he didn't do it. She did, and when the truth emerged years later, there was nothing, no evidence, no witnesses, no documentation, that proved she was guilty. This is the story of the crime nobody could prosecute because the criminal was never the accused. In 1955 Boston, there was a particular kind of credibility that mattered more than anything else. The credibility of a betrayed wife, a woman who had discovered her husband's crime, and, despite her own pain, had reported it to authorities. A woman who had to sit in a courtroom and testify against the man she'd promised to love forever. That kind of credibility was unshakable. That kind of credibility was believed without question. And Sarah Day understood this with the precision of someone who had studied human nature, the way a jeweler studies light through a diamond. The genius of her crime wasn't in how she stole the money. It was in how she positioned herself as the only person who could see what had happened. She was the witness. She was the victim. She was the person the jury would protect. And because everyone was looking at her as the woman who had been wronged, nobody was looking at her as the woman who was committing the crime. This is what happens when someone understands the psychology of credibility better than the legal system understands guilt. This is the story of how a woman became invisible as a criminal by becoming visible as a victim. To understand why Sarah did what she did, you have to understand what she was running from. Not her husband, herself, or more precisely, the version of herself she was becoming. A woman she recognized from her childhood. A woman she had promised never to become. Sarah was born in 1922 in Providence, Rhode Island, to a father who managed a textile mill and a mother who managed a household with the precision of someone who had no other choice. Her mother's days were identical. Breakfast prepared before her husband arrived at the kitchen table, lunch packed in his coat pocket, dinner ready at 6 o'clock precisely. Her mother asked for nothing. Her mother wanted nothing. Her mother had learned that wanting things was a vulnerability, so she stopped wanting. By the time Sarah was 12, she understood that her mother had disappeared into her own life so completely that nobody even noticed she was gone anymore. Her father controlled the money, all of it. Her mother received an allowance, actual cash, counted out by her husband each Friday, for groceries and household expenses. If she needed anything beyond that, she had to ask. Sarah watched her mother ask for a new coat in 1938, and watch her father say no, they couldn't afford it, and then watch her father buy himself a new car 3 months later. She watched her mother's face during that moment, watched the calculation happen behind her eyes. This is what marriage costs. This is the price of security. Sarah made a different choice. She became brilliant. She learned mathematics and finance the way other girls learned embroidery. She kept a ledger of the household accounts starting at age 14, just to understand how money moved. She read everything she could find about business, about property ownership, about the legal structures that allowed men to control everything. She was preparing for a life her mother had never imagined was possible, a life where she would never ask permission for anything. When she met Thomas Day in 1948, he seemed like the right person to practice with. He was an engineer with a good salary, a position at a respected firm, and the kind of stability that would allow her to build something. She married him because he was safe, because his income was reliable, and because she thought she could manage the arrangement. She didn't marry him for love. She married him for logistics. For 6 years, the marriage functioned exactly as she had planned. Thomas worked. Sarah managed the household finances with precision. She invested their savings carefully. She read everything that was published about stock markets and bond yields. She positioned herself as the financial mind of the household, while Thomas focused on his engineering work. Thomas was satisfied with this arrangement. He believed he had married a competent woman. He didn't understand that competence was a mask over resentment. The resentment started small. A dinner party where Thomas made a joke about how much Sarah spent on groceries, as if she were a child who needed to be monitored. A conversation with his mother where she heard him describe Sarah as good with numbers, the way he might describe a useful tool. A moment in 1953 when she asked Thomas for permission to invest some of their savings in a business opportunity, and he said no, that was too risky, and she understood in that moment that he didn't trust her judgment. He trusted her obedience. By 1954, Sarah realized she was becoming her mother. She had a comfortable life, financial security, a husband who didn't drink or cheat, and absolutely no autonomy. She was disappearing into the same role her mother had played, just with a different set of furniture. The realization didn't come as sadness. It came as fury. She began to notice things she had overlooked before. The way Thomas expected her to have dinner ready whether she had been at home all day or not. The way he opened her mail before she did. The way he had never once asked her opinion about his work, even though she understood finance better than he did. The way he referred to their money but meant his money. The way he had shaped her into the exact version of a wife he wanted, and now that she was that person, he took her for granted completely. By the spring of 1954, Sarah had made a decision. She was going to leave him, but she wasn't going to leave as a woman who had failed at marriage. She wasn't going to leave as a woman who had been unhappy or unfulfilled. She was going to leave as a woman who had been betrayed. She was going to leave as a victim, because she understood, with perfect clarity, that a woman who left her marriage voluntarily was a failure, but a woman who left her marriage because her husband had betrayed her was someone to be pitied, supported, and protected. She needed a reason that would make sense of her departure, a reason that would transform her from a woman who was dissatisfied into a woman who was wronged. She needed to become the victim her mother had never been brave enough to become. The theft wasn't about money. She already had access to money. The theft was about creating the narrative that would allow her to disappear and rebuild. The theft was about having something to testify to, something that would make her credible, something that would make people believe her version of the truth so completely that they would never think to question her. What Sarah didn't understand, not yet, was that to tell the story convincingly, she would have to tell it against the one person who loved her most, the one person who had never once raised his voice to her, the one person who had done exactly what she asked of him. Thomas Day was not a villain in any conventional sense. He was simply a man who had married a woman he thought he understood, and he had never imagined that understanding could be used as a weapon against him. The embezzlement began in June 1954, not because Thomas needed the money, his salary was more than adequate, but because Sarah had decided that for her crime to be believable, it had to be real. She couldn't fabricate evidence from nothing. She needed actual theft, actual missing money, actual proof that something had been taken. The question was, who would be blamed for it? Sarah's plan was elegant in its simplicity. She had access to the household finances and all of Thomas's bank statements. Thomas was a methodical man, but he was not suspicious. He trusted his wife with the details of their finances because that had always been their arrangement. For 6 years, she had earned that trust by being exactly what he needed: competent, reliable, and incurious about anything beyond her sphere. The company Thomas worked for, Markham Engineering, a mid-sized firm with approximately 70 employees, had accounting systems that were state-of-the-art for 1954, which is to say they were still largely manual. Ledgers were kept by hand. Reconciliations happened monthly. There were audits, but they were conducted by other men from the industry, men who knew Thomas, men who trusted him. The assumption was always that the crime, if there was one, would be discovered by the auditors. The assumption was never that the auditors themselves might miss something. Sarah began researching how money moved through the company. She asked Thomas innocent questions about his work. How did the accounting department process invoices? Who had access to the accounts? How often were they reconciled? Thomas answered these questions the way he answered all her questions, thoroughly, assuming she was simply interested in his work. He never imagined she was mapping the vulnerabilities in his company's financial system. In July 1954, Sarah opened a bank account in her own name at a small savings bank across town. She told Thomas she wanted to start saving for a car. She deposited $200 of her own money to establish the account. The bank manager was a man named Harold Morrison, who knew her from community events and found her to be a pleasant, unremarkable woman. She was exactly the kind of wife he would have wanted, educated enough to manage finances, feminine enough to be non-threatening, and clearly devoted to her husband and household. Then Sarah created a fictitious vendor. The vendor was called Hartley Supply, a firm that supposedly provided engineering materials to Markham Engineering. The vendor had a business address, a mail drop she rented using a false name, a telephone number, connected to a switchboard service that would take messages, and a legitimacy that came from the fact that Hartley Supply actually supplied materials to other firms. Sarah's job was simply to insert Hartley Supply into Markham Engineering's purchasing process in a way that would be invisible. She began by creating false invoices. These weren't sophisticated forgeries. They were simply documents that looked exactly like the legitimate invoices from Markham Engineering's other vendors. She had access to company stationery and letterhead. Thomas sometimes brought work home. She studied the format of the invoices that came into the household. She created invoices for Hartley Supply that were indistinguishable from the real ones. Supplies delivered, quantities listed, amounts due. The amounts started small, $50 for a particular order of materials, $75 for another. The invoices were submitted to the accounting department, where a clerk would compare them to the purchase order, which Sarah had also created, forging Thomas's signature with practice and precision, and then cut a check. The check would be mailed to the address on the invoice. Sarah would collect the check. Sarah would deposit it into the Hartley Supply account, which she had opened using the false name and a forged identification document that she had obtained from someone she knew who made such things, a man who didn't ask too many questions and who worked in a photography studio in Cambridge. For 4 months, this system worked perfectly. By October 1954, Sarah had successfully transferred approximately $12,000 into the Hartley Supply account without anyone noticing. The amounts were small enough that they didn't trigger attention. The invoices were legitimate enough to pass casual inspection. The purchase orders existed in the system. The checks were issued and cashed. The money disappeared. But Sarah understood that this was simply the foundation. The actual crime, the part that would make her credible, would begin when she reported it. In November 1954, Sarah went to Thomas with a concerned expression and a question. She had been organizing some household papers, she said, and she had noticed something odd in the bank statements. There was money going out to a vendor called Hartley Supply. She didn't recognize the company. Did Thomas know anything about them? Had he authorized some new vendor relationship? Thomas looked at the bank statement. He didn't recognize the name either. He said he would check with the accounting department at work. He would figure it out. It was probably nothing. Sarah had calculated exactly how much time would pass before Thomas checked with the accounting department. Before the accounting department confirmed that yes, Hartley Supply was in the system, and yes, they had been receiving invoices from them and cutting checks. Thomas would come home confused. He would say he still didn't understand the vendor, that it wasn't something he had approved. He would look at the documentation and see his own signature on the purchase orders, and he would be confused because he wouldn't remember signing them. But the signature was his, or it looked like his, and who else could have done it? Sarah would comfort him. She would say perhaps he had forgotten authorizing it, that these things happened when work was busy, but he seemed worried about it, so perhaps they should be cautious. Perhaps he should contact the company and ask for documentation about what materials had actually been delivered. When no materials could be accounted for, because no materials had actually been delivered, Thomas would become genuinely alarmed. By December 1954, Thomas had realized something was very wrong. He called a meeting with his supervisor, a man named Edgar Whitmore, and showed him the documentation. Edgar looked at the purchase orders, looked at the invoices, looked at the canceled checks, and his face went pale, because what he was seeing looked like evidence that Thomas had been systematically stealing from the company. Edgar asked the question Thomas had been dreading. "Did you authorize these purchases?" Thomas said no. He was absolutely certain he had not. But the signature looked like his. The documentation was in the system. Someone had done this, but it wasn't him. Edgar said, "Thomas, I need to ask you something directly. Are you in financial trouble? Is there something going on that I should know about?" Thomas said no. His finances were fine. He was confused and concerned, but he was not in financial trouble. Edgar made a decision in that moment that would change everything. He decided to contact the company's auditors and report what he had found. He said nothing to Thomas about what would happen next. He simply said they would investigate, and in the meantime, Thomas should say nothing to anyone about this. Thomas came home that evening terrified. He told Sarah everything. He said he didn't understand what had happened. He said the documentation made it look like he had been stealing, but he hadn't. He said the company was going to investigate. He said he didn't know what to do. Sarah listened to all of this with an expression of concern and support. She held his hand. She said they would get through this together. She said the truth would come out. And then she said something that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. "I believe you. I know you didn't do this, and I will do whatever I need to do to prove it." What Thomas didn't understand was that she had already done exactly what she needed to do. She had created the evidence. She had positioned herself as the person who discovered it. She had set in motion a sequence of events that would lead directly to his destruction. In the first week of January 1955, the company's auditors arrived. They were two men named Robert Hayes and Chester Fitzpatrick, both experienced auditors, both men who had worked with Thomas's company before, both men who knew Thomas socially. They went through the accounting records with precision. They looked at every invoice, every purchase order, every canceled check. They traced the paper trail of the embezzlement. What they found was a professional, systematic theft of $47,000 over a 4-month period. The perpetrator had forged purchase orders. The perpetrator had created fake invoices. The perpetrator had inserted themselves into the accounting process in a way that suggested they had inside knowledge of how the system worked. The perpetrator had been methodical and careful. The auditors sat down with Edgar Whitmore and delivered their conclusion. The evidence points to Thomas Day. The forged documents are in his handwriting, or close enough to it. He had access to all the necessary materials. He had the knowledge to create false vendors. This looks like an inside job, and Thomas is the only person with the motive, method, and opportunity. What the auditors didn't realize, what nobody realized, was that the handwriting on the purchase orders wasn't Thomas's. It was Sarah's. Sarah had spent weeks practicing his signature, learning the particular way he looped his letters, the pressure he used when he wrote, the angle at which he held his pen. She had studied his handwriting the way a forger studies the brushstrokes of a painter. By the time she began forging the purchase orders, her version of his signature was indistinguishable from his actual signature. She had learned not just to copy his handwriting, but to become his handwriting. She had learned to write like him. The auditors also didn't know that Sarah had been in her husband's office on 3 separate occasions when he was at meetings. His supervisor had given her access because she said she needed to retrieve something Thomas had left at work. While she was there, she had photographed documents, studied the filing systems, and identified exactly where and how she needed to insert the false invoices to make them invisible. On January 10, 1955, the auditors presented their findings to the company's leadership. They recommended that Thomas be immediately terminated and that the matter be reported to the police. Thomas was brought into a meeting with Edgar Whitmore and the company's owner, a man named Douglas Markham. They showed him the documentation. They asked him directly if he had stolen from the company. Thomas said no. He said he didn't understand how the documentation had gotten into the system, but he hadn't done it. He said his wife had discovered the strange vendor, and he had reported it immediately. He said if he had been stealing, he wouldn't have brought it to their attention. Douglas Markham looked at him with the expression of a man who had been personally betrayed. He said, "Thomas, I trusted you. I gave you a position of responsibility. And this is what you do?" And he said the company would be filing a police report. He said Thomas should speak to a lawyer. Thomas left the company that day. He went home and told Sarah that he had been fired, that the company was reporting him to the police, and that he didn't understand why because he hadn't done anything wrong. Sarah said, "We'll get through this. I'll testify to the police that I discovered the discrepancy. I'll tell them that I'm the one who first noticed the problem." And she did exactly that. When the Boston Police Department's White-Collar Crime Division began their investigation in late January 1955, they interviewed Sarah Day. She told them that she had been reviewing the household finances, that she had noticed transactions that didn't match her husband's income, and that she had asked Thomas about them. She said Thomas had seemed confused at first, but then he had admitted to her in private that he had been stealing from the company. She said he had told her he was in financial trouble, that he had gambling debts, that he needed the money. She said she had been shocked and devastated, but that she had known it was her responsibility to report it. None of this was true, but it was told by a woman whose credibility seemed unquestionable. She was a housewife. She had no motive to lie. She had betrayed her own husband to do what was right. She was the kind of woman the police believed. She was the kind of witness a prosecutor could build an entire case around. The investigators asked her a crucial question. "Did your husband ever tell you directly that he was stealing from the company?" Sarah said yes. She said he had confessed to her. She said he had been frightened and ashamed and he had told her everything. She said he had asked her not to tell anyone, but that she couldn't live with that secret. She had to do what was right. Thomas was arrested on February 3, 1955. The charges were grand larceny and forgery. His bail was set at $15,000, which he couldn't afford. His family hired a lawyer named Michael Brennan, who looked at the evidence and felt his stomach drop, because the evidence was overwhelming. The signatures on the forged documents matched Thomas's signature. The purchase orders were in the system. The invoices were legitimate looking. The checks had been cashed, and Thomas's own wife had testified that he had confessed to her. What Michael Brennan didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that he was looking at a crime scene where the criminal had positioned someone else as the victim, and the victim had positioned someone else as the criminal. Everything was inverted. Everything was backwards. And the legal system had been designed in a way that made it almost impossible to see the inversion. The trial began on April 18, 1955. The courtroom was crowded. Thomas Day was a well-known engineer in Boston. Markham Engineering was a respected firm. A white-collar crime case was still relatively rare, and the spectacle of a man stealing from his own company, a man who appeared respectable and educated, drew attention. The prosecutor was a man named Richard Halverson, a career prosecutor who had built his reputation on clean convictions and thorough preparation. He had looked at the evidence against Thomas Day and seen an open and shut case. The documentation was clear. The signatures matched. The witness testimony was compelling. This was not a case that required subtle argumentation. This was a case where the facts spoke for themselves. Thomas's lawyer, Michael Brennan, was a good lawyer, but he was working with the worst possible evidence. His client denied the crime, but his client's own signature appeared to be on the forged documents. His client's wife testified that he had confessed. The accounting department had traced the theft directly to his client. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Brennan's strategy was simple. He would argue that Thomas had been framed. He would suggest that someone else had access to the company's systems and had forged Thomas's signature. He would argue that Sarah's testimony was unreliable because wives had a motive to protect their husbands or, conversely, to harm them if the marriage was troubled. This strategy failed immediately because Brennan didn't understand that Sarah had anticipated this exact approach. She had built her crime in a way that made the framing impossible to prove. She had forged the signatures herself, which meant the handwriting was consistent and expert. She had created false evidence that would hold up under scrutiny. She had positioned herself not as a potential suspect, but as the discoverer of the crime. When Sarah testified, she wore a navy dress with a white collar. She wore her wedding ring prominently. She sat in the witness box and told the truth about everything except the essential fact. She testified that she had noticed discrepancies in the household finances. She testified that she had asked Thomas about them. She testified that Thomas had become nervous and evasive. She testified that he had eventually confessed to her that he had been stealing from the company. She testified that she had been devastated by this confession, but that she had known it was her duty to report it. The prosecutor asked her, "Mrs. Day, when your husband confessed to you, did he seem remorseful?" Sarah said, "He seemed frightened. He seemed ashamed, but I don't think he fully understood the gravity of what he had done." The prosecutor asked her, "In your opinion, Mrs. Day, is your husband capable of committing a crime?" Sarah hesitated, as if this question pained her deeply. She said, "I believed I knew my husband, but if he was capable of lying to his company, of forging documents, of stealing, then clearly I didn't know him at all." This testimony was devastating to Thomas, because it came from the one person who supposedly knew him best. If his own wife testified that he had confessed to her, that he had seemed capable of this crime, that she had been shocked to discover who he really was, then what defense could possibly overcome that? Michael Brennan cross-examined Sarah carefully. He asked her, "Mrs. Day, when did your husband confess this crime to you?" Sarah said, "In December, after the accounting department began asking questions." Brennan asked, "And did he give you any explanation for why he had done it?" Sarah said, "He said he was in financial trouble. He said he needed money." Brennan asked, "And were you, in fact, in financial trouble at that time?" Sarah said, "No. Our finances were stable. I managed them carefully. I don't know why he said that." Brennan asked, "Mrs. Day, is it possible that your husband was confused when he spoke to you? Is it possible that he was denying the crime, and you misunderstood him?" Sarah said, "No. He was very clear. He told me he had done it. He asked me not to tell anyone." Every answer Sarah gave was crafted to be absolutely consistent. She never wavered. She never contradicted herself. She testified as a woman who was reluctantly betraying her husband because her conscience demanded it. She testified as a woman who had loved her husband and had been destroyed by his betrayal. She testified as exactly the kind of witness that the jury wanted to believe. What Brennan didn't understand, what nobody in that courtroom understood, was that Sarah was a better liar than anyone had given her credit for. She wasn't performing grief at her husband's deception. She wasn't acting the part of a betrayed wife. She had become so completely identified with the role she had created that the distinction between performance and reality had disappeared. When she testified that she was devastated by her husband's crime, she believed it. When she testified that she didn't know him, she believed that too. She had constructed a narrative so complete that it had become, in her own mind, the absolute truth. The jury listened to this testimony, and they saw exactly what Sarah had calculated they would see: a devoted wife, forced by conscience to testify against the man she loved, broken by the revelation that the person she had married was capable of such betrayal. They saw a woman whose credibility was unquestionable because her testimony was against her own interests. Thomas was convicted on May 12, 1955, on counts of grand larceny and forgery. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The evidence was overwhelming. The witness testimony was compelling. The signature on the forged documents matched the defendant's signature. There was no reasonable doubt. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison on June 3, 1955. What Thomas felt during this period was a particular kind of psychological devastation that most people never experience. He was being accused of a crime he hadn't committed by the person he had trusted most completely. The evidence against him was real, solid, and impossible to refute because it had been carefully fabricated by someone who knew exactly how to make fabrication look like reality. He was trapped in a nightmare where everyone around him, the judge, the jury, the prosecutor, his own lawyer, all believed he was guilty and he knew he was innocent, but he had no way to prove it. His parents believed him. His sister believed him, but nobody else did. The company believed the auditor's findings. The police believed the evidence. The jury believed his wife's testimony. In the court of public opinion, Thomas Day was a thief and a liar. In the court of law, he was a convicted felon. He appealed his conviction, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that his wife's testimony was unreliable. The appeals court reviewed the case and found no grounds for reversal. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was direct and documented. The wife's testimony was credible. The signatures matched. The case stood. What nobody noticed, what nobody had any reason to notice, was that after Thomas's conviction, Sarah had quietly closed the Hartley Supply account and transferred the money into legitimate savings accounts. She had paid off the mortgage on the house. She had invested in stocks that would pay dividends for years. She had secured her financial independence using money that had cost her husband his freedom, and she had done it in a way that made her not just wealthy, but also sympathetic, because now she was the wife of a convicted embezzler. Now she was the woman who had shown the courage to testify against her own husband. Now she was the woman left alone to manage her household and her finances, while her husband served his sentence. People felt sorry for her. Thomas Day began serving his sentence at Concord State Prison in June 1955. The prison was a 19th century structure designed to house men who had committed crimes, but it was not designed for men like Thomas. He was a white-collar professional who had never been in trouble, who had never even had a traffic violation, and who now found himself stripped of his identity and his freedom based on evidence that he knew he hadn't created. The experience of being imprisoned for a crime you didn't commit is a particular kind of psychological torture that most people never understand. It's not the bars or the confined space or even the loss of freedom that destroys you. It's the knowledge that everyone around you, the judge, the jury, the other prisoners, the guards, the prosecutors, all believe you are guilty. It's the knowledge that the truth of your innocence exists only in your own mind, and no one will listen to it. Thomas tried to maintain his sanity by focusing on what he knew to be true. He had not stolen from Markham Engineering. He had not forged documents. He had not created false vendors. These facts were absolute. They were the foundation on which his entire self-concept rested. As long as he could hold on to this truth, he believed he could survive the imprisonment. But something else was happening during this time, something that Thomas didn't fully understand until much later. While he was in prison, Sarah was rebuilding their life. She paid the legal fees that had drained their savings. She paid the household expenses. She paid the mortgage. She did all of this with a kind of efficiency and competence that suggested she had been preparing for exactly this situation for years. Sarah also did something else. She began quietly separating her finances from Thomas's. She moved money into accounts in her own name. She changed the beneficiaries on insurance policies. She consulted with a lawyer about separation agreements and divorce proceedings. She was not yet ready to leave, but she was preparing the groundwork for her departure. She was also careful to maintain the appearance of a devoted wife. She visited Thomas in prison once a month. She brought him magazines and books. She told him that she believed in his innocence and that they would get through this together. She told him that she was managing their finances and that everything would be all right when he was released. Thomas believed her, because what choice did he have? His wife was his only connection to the life he had lost. If he allowed himself to distrust her, he would have nothing left. So he chose to believe her. He chose to believe that she was supporting him, that she loved him, that when he was released, they would rebuild their life together. What he didn't understand was that she had moved on long ago. She had left the marriage in every way except legally. She was using the time of his imprisonment to consolidate her position, to solidify her finances, and to prepare for the moment when she would no longer need him. During the 3 years of Thomas's imprisonment, something else happened that would eventually undermine his conviction. Accounting systems began to evolve. The manual ledgers that had been standard in 1954 began to give way to more sophisticated bookkeeping methods. The auditors who had testified against Thomas retired. The people who had been involved in the original investigation moved on to other cases. And then, in 1958, something happened that nobody had anticipated. A clerical error in the company's accounting department revealed that there had been another unauthorized transaction in the system, a transaction that predated Thomas's supposed theft and that bore no resemblance to his supposed crime. A young auditor named Gerald Weinstein, who was reviewing old records for a completely different purpose, noticed an inconsistency in the 1953 accounts. He investigated further and discovered that someone had been systematically removing small amounts of money from a different account, using a different method, over a different time period. Gerald reported this finding to the company, and a new investigation began. This investigation uncovered the fact that there had been multiple unauthorized transactions in the accounting system, some of which could not have been committed by Thomas, because he didn't have access to those accounts at the time they occurred. This suggested that either there had been multiple embezzlers, or there was a fundamental flaw in the audit process itself. A new auditor was brought in, a man named Paul Richardson, who was more meticulous than the original auditors. Paul began tracing the original embezzlement again, this time with fresh eyes and the benefit of hindsight. He began examining the Hartley Supply transactions more carefully. He obtained samples of Thomas's handwriting from the company's records and compared them to the signatures on the purchase orders. He did this comparison not just visually, but with the help of a document examiner, something that hadn't been done during the original investigation. The document examiner, a man named Harold Kasdorf, examined the purchase orders carefully. He studied the loops, the pressure, the angle of the letters. He compared them to verified samples of Thomas's handwriting. His conclusion was shocking. The signatures on the purchase orders were not Thomas's. They were close but not exact. They were the work of someone who had studied Thomas's handwriting and had attempted to replicate it, but who had never quite achieved perfect consistency. Paul Richardson reported these findings to Markham Engineering's leadership, and the company faced a dilemma. If the signatures were not Thomas's, then Thomas had been convicted based on false evidence. The company had allowed an innocent man to be imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. The implications of this were staggering, both legally and for the company's reputation. But the company also realized something else. The original embezzlement had actually occurred. Money had been stolen. The Hartley Supply scheme had been real. Someone had committed this crime. And if it wasn't Thomas, then who? The company's leadership faced a choice. They could reopen the investigation and attempt to discover who had actually committed the crime. Or they could quietly settle the matter and move on. They chose to move on. They understood that a full investigation would eventually lead to questions about how the crime had been committed, and that those questions would lead to Sarah Day. Sarah Day, who was now a woman of independent means. Sarah Day, who was now living in Vermont with her second husband. Sarah Day, who was no longer in their lives and who posed no threat to them. Prosecuting Sarah would only bring more attention to the company's role in the miscarriage of justice. It would expose the audit process as fundamentally flawed. It would suggest that the company's security systems were so porous that any educated person could fabricate a complex theft. So the company made a decision. They would inform Thomas that new evidence had emerged, and that this evidence suggested he had been wrongly convicted. They would request that he accept a settlement in exchange for the company's assistance in pursuing a pardon. Thomas would be released from prison. The company would not be sued for wrongful imprisonment, and the matter would be closed. In 1958, Thomas Day was released from prison after serving 3 years of his 5-year sentence for a crime he did not commit. He was exonerated, legally and officially, but exoneration came too late to restore what had been taken from him. When Thomas Day walked out of Concord State Prison in July 1958, he was 42 years old, and he had aged 20 years. His hair had turned completely gray. There were permanent lines around his eyes from the fluorescent lights of the prison cells. He weighed 30 pounds less than he had 3 years before, and his mind had a quality that people who had never been imprisoned could never quite understand. A kind of brokenness that exists below the surface, a kind of psychological fracture that never quite heals. He had been released because new evidence had emerged suggesting he was innocent. The company had helped secure his pardon, which meant he would be free, but it also meant that the only institution that could have publicly acknowledged the miscarriage of justice had instead chosen silence. Thomas was released quietly. There was no announcement. There was no press conference. There was no acknowledgement of the years that had been taken from him. He returned to the house in Boston where Sarah was still living. She had stayed in the house during his imprisonment, managing it, maintaining it, and waiting for the right moment to leave. When Thomas came home, Sarah was kind to him. She was supportive. She told him that she had always believed in his innocence. She told him that she was proud of him for surviving the ordeal. And then, 6 months later, she told him that she had met someone else and that she wanted a divorce. The divorce proceedings were neither contentious nor difficult. Sarah asked for the house, which Thomas let her have. She asked for the investment she had accumulated during his imprisonment, which Thomas let her have. She asked for a settlement, and Thomas agreed to it. There was nothing to fight for because there was nothing left to fight with. Thomas was broken. Thomas was unemployable. Thomas was a man who had been convicted of a crime and then exonerated, which meant nobody wanted to hire him because he represented liability. Sarah received everything she wanted. The divorce was finalized in 1959. By that time, she had already moved to Vermont with her new husband, a man named Robert Sinclair who owned a small hotel business. She changed her name to Sarah Sinclair. She became a new person, just as she had always known how to do. Thomas never remarried. He worked in construction for most of the rest of his life, which was the only kind of work available to a man with his background. He didn't make much money, but he made enough to survive. He lived in a small apartment in Cambridge. He kept to himself. He read voraciously, particularly books about psychology and human nature, as if he were trying to understand years after the fact what his wife had been capable of. The thing that haunted Thomas most was not the imprisonment itself. It was the knowledge that his wife had testified against him. It was the knowledge that the woman he had loved and trusted had orchestrated his destruction with such precision that nobody had ever discovered the truth. It was the knowledge that he had spent 3 years in prison while she built wealth using the money she had stolen. Years later, after his release, Thomas would sometimes think about the moment when Sarah had testified. He would remember her sitting in the witness box, wearing that navy dress with the white collar, answering questions with perfect consistency. He would remember the expression on her face, an expression of sadness and reluctance, as if she was being forced to betray the person she loved. He would remember the jury believing her. He would remember understanding, in that moment, that he was lost, that he had no defense against the credibility of someone who had planned this so carefully. What Thomas didn't understand until much later was something more fundamental. Sarah hadn't been performing sadness. She hadn't been faking her expression of reluctant betrayal. She had genuinely believed what she was testifying to. By the time she sat in that witness box, she had told herself the story so many times that the distinction between truth and lie had become meaningless to her. She had genuinely believed that her husband had confessed to her. She had genuinely believed that he was the thief. She had achieved something psychologically remarkable. She had committed a crime while simultaneously positioning herself as the victim of that crime, and she had believed in both versions of reality simultaneously. This is the particular horror of sophisticated deception. It doesn't require the deceiver to be psychologically unwell. It doesn't require them to be a sociopath or a person without conscience. It requires them to be someone who has practiced lying so thoroughly, so consistently and so carefully, that the lie becomes indistinguishable from truth. It requires someone who has the capacity to believe in their own fabrication, to internalize it, to make it real in their own mind before attempting to make it real in anyone else's mind. Thomas's release from prison didn't restore his life. It simply allowed him to live a different kind of captivity. The captivity of knowing that he had been destroyed by someone who loved him, or at least who had claimed to love him. It's unclear which is worse, being murdered or being imprisoned by someone you trust. At least murder is quick. What did Thomas learn about himself? He learned that judgment was not a reliable tool for understanding other people. He learned that someone could deceive you while sleeping in your bed. He learned that the legal system could fail you even when you were innocent, and that the person who testified against you could be more convincing than any evidence. He learned that trust is a vulnerability, and that vulnerability is something that can be weaponized against you. And he learned something else. He learned that he was capable of forgiving, because even after everything Sarah had done, even after 3 years in prison for her crimes, even after losing his career and his reputation and his peace of mind, Thomas never expressed hatred for his wife. He expressed sadness. He expressed confusion. He expressed a kind of broken acceptance that some people are capable of remarkable deception, and that this capacity has nothing to do with morality or conscience. It has to do with need. It has to do with the human ability to justify almost anything if the justification serves your survival. While Thomas was in prison, Sarah had the opportunity to become someone completely different, and this is what she did with remarkable precision. She didn't just separate her identity from Thomas's, she actively constructed a new identity that bore no resemblance to the woman she had been. In the first year of Thomas's imprisonment, Sarah established herself in Boston society as a woman of sympathy and strength. She was the devoted wife of a criminal, yes, but she was also a woman who had made the difficult moral choice to testify against him. She was a woman who could have hidden the crime, who could have protected her husband, but who had chosen to do what was right. This made her, in the eyes of many people, more trustworthy than the criminals themselves. She became involved in charity work. She volunteered with organizations that helped women in difficult circumstances. She gave talks about how to recognize if your spouse is engaging in dishonest behavior. She positioned herself as an expert on deception, on trust, and on the psychology of crime, all based on her experience as a victim of her husband's deception. She was invited to social events. She was asked to serve on boards. She was treated as a woman of character and resilience. And because she was intelligent and capable, she performed these roles flawlessly. She never showed bitterness. She never expressed anger toward Thomas. She simply expressed sadness at having been betrayed by someone she loved. This emotional restraint made her more credible. This willingness to see her husband's crime as a tragedy rather than a betrayal made her more sympathetic. People wanted to help her. They wanted to invest in her. A businessman named Richard Ashford, who had made his fortune in insurance, offered to help her manage her finances. He was impressed by her intelligence and her grasp of investment principles. Within a year of Thomas's imprisonment, Sarah had accumulated approximately $85,000 in investments under Ashford's guidance, money that had come partially from the Hartley supply theft and partially from the household savings that Thomas had accumulated during their marriage. This was significant wealth in 1956. This was wealth that gave Sarah options. This was wealth that gave her security. This was wealth that meant she could divorce Thomas without fear of being financially devastated. This was wealth that meant she could reinvent herself. By 1958, when Thomas was released from prison, Sarah had already begun the process of leaving him. She had consulted with a lawyer about divorce. She had secured her finances. She had positioned her assets in such a way that Thomas would have no claim to them. The money that had cost him 3 years of his life was now completely hers, and there was no legal mechanism by which he could ever recover it. When she told Thomas that she wanted a divorce, she did so with compassion. She said she had tried to stay in the marriage, that she had believed she could make it work, but she said she couldn't live with the knowledge of what he had done. She said it was destroying her. She said it was kinder to both of them if they went their separate ways. Thomas was so broken by his imprisonment that he offered no resistance. He wanted the divorce as much as she did. The marriage was a wreckage. Both of them understood this. The only thing that had held it together was the implicit agreement that Thomas would deny the crime, would accept his punishment, and would somehow rehabilitate himself. But Thomas had been imprisoned for Sarah's crime, and the knowledge of that had poisoned everything between them. The divorce was finalized in 1959. Sarah received the house, which she immediately sold for a profit. She received the investments, which she consolidated and managed carefully. She received a settlement from Thomas of approximately $10,000, money that was barely enough to represent a portion of what she had actually stolen from the company. More importantly, she received her freedom. In 1960, Sarah married Robert Sinclair, a man 14 years her senior who owned a successful hotel business in Vermont. Robert was widowed, he had lost his first wife to cancer, and he was looking for a woman who could manage his household and his social obligations. Sarah was exactly what he was looking for. She was intelligent, capable, and sympathetic. She had experienced loss. She understood the weight of tragedy. She was beautiful in the way that widows sometimes are, with a kind of poignant dignity that comes from having survived something terrible. Robert had no idea that Sarah had fabricated her own tragedy. He believed her story about her husband's crime and her decision to testify against him. He believed that she had suffered greatly. He believed that she deserved happiness. He believed, as many people do, that he could provide that happiness and that she would be grateful. But Sarah had never been capable of gratitude in the conventional sense. Gratitude required acknowledging that someone had given you something, and Sarah experienced the world as something that she had to take, not something that was given to her. So she married Robert with the intention of taking everything he had built, and she set about doing this with the same precision and intelligence that she had used to destroy Thomas. It took her less than 2 years to assume complete control of Robert's finances. She became the bookkeeper for the hotel business. She became the manager of his personal accounts. She positioned herself as his most trusted advisor, and then she began moving money. Unlike the Hartley supply theft, which had been designed to be discovered and blamed on Thomas, the theft from Robert was designed to be invisible. She moved money slowly, using legitimate business expenses as cover. She invested money in accounts that were technically in both their names but that Robert never looked at. She paid herself increasingly substantial salaries for managing the business, salaries that Robert authorized because he trusted her and because she explained them as market rates for the work she was doing. Over 3 years, Sarah transferred approximately $120,000 from Robert's accounts into her own name. Robert was entirely unaware that this was happening. He knew he was less wealthy than he had been before he married Sarah, but he attributed this to the general downturn in the hotel business. He didn't understand that his wife was systematically dismantling his wealth. By 1963, Sarah had accumulated approximately $200,000 in her own name. This was extraordinary wealth, more wealth than the average American family would accumulate in a lifetime. This was wealth that gave her absolute security. This was wealth that meant she never had to depend on anyone again. And then she left Robert. She told him that she had met someone else. She told him that she wanted to move on. She told him that their marriage wasn't what she had hoped it would be. She filed for divorce. And in the divorce settlement, negotiated by a lawyer who had no idea what Sarah had done, she received an additional $50,000 in alimony. By the mid-1960s, Sarah had completed her transformation. She had moved from being a woman imprisoned in a marriage she resented to being a woman of independent means. She had stolen from her husband and positioned him as the criminal. She had testified against him and destroyed his life. She had taken the money she had stolen and used it to build a new life with a different man. She had stolen from that man and left him broken, and she had done all of this while maintaining the appearance of being a devoted, sympathetic, intelligent woman. What makes Sarah's story particularly chilling is that she never experienced consequences. She was never charged with a crime. She was never prosecuted. She was never held accountable in any legal sense. The company knew what she had done, but they chose silence. Thomas knew what she had done, but he had no proof. Robert knew what she had done, but he was too ashamed to pursue it. The legal system, which had been weaponized against Thomas so effectively, was powerless against Sarah because Sarah had never been the accused. The truth about what Sarah had done began to emerge in 1962, when Paul Richardson conducted his audit of the original Hartley supply theft. But the truth didn't emerge all at once. It emerged in pieces, in fragments, in moments that nobody connected until it was too late. Paul Richardson's document examination revealed that the signatures on the purchase orders didn't match Thomas's handwriting. This led to questions about who had actually committed the theft. The company conducted an internal investigation, and this investigation eventually uncovered the fact that Sarah had opened bank accounts in her own name during the time of the supposed embezzlement. This led to further questions about Sarah's involvement. But by this time, Sarah had been divorced from Thomas for 3 years, and she had been married to Robert Sinclair for 2 years. She was no longer in Boston. She was no longer accessible to easy questioning, and more importantly, the money had disappeared. There was no financial trail that led from the Hartley supply theft directly to Sarah's accounts, because she had been careful to obscure the trail. The company's leadership faced a decision. They could pursue Sarah and attempt to recover the stolen money, or they could accept that pursuing her would be difficult and expensive, and that the publicity would damage the company. They chose to focus on clearing Thomas's name and moving on. But in 1962, something happened that even the company couldn't control. A young auditor named Gerald Weinstein mentioned the discrepancy in the original audit to a journalist named Margaret Collins, who was researching a story about white-collar crime in Boston. Margaret was intrigued by the story of Thomas Day, who had been imprisoned for a crime he hadn't committed, and she decided to investigate further. Margaret interviewed Paul Richardson, the auditor who had discovered the forgeries. Paul told her about the document examination, about the signatures that didn't match, about the questions that suggested Sarah might have been involved. Margaret then attempted to interview Sarah, but Sarah refused to speak to her. This refusal made Margaret more suspicious. Margaret began digging deeper. Margaret discovered that Sarah had opened bank accounts under a false name during the time of the theft. She discovered that Sarah had married Robert Sinclair and had since been divorced from him. She contacted Robert and asked him if he knew anything about Sarah's financial history. Robert was reluctant to discuss his ex-wife, but Margaret was persistent. She suggested that Sarah might have stolen from him as well. This accusation shocked Robert. He contacted his accountant and asked her to audit the hotel business during the years Sarah had been involved. The accountant discovered that approximately $120,000 was unaccounted for, money that Sarah had systematically moved into her own accounts. Robert was devastated. He had suspected that his marriage was unhappy, but he had never imagined that his wife was stealing from him. In December 1962, Margaret published a story in a Boston newspaper about the Hartley supply theft, about Thomas Day's wrongful imprisonment, and about the possibility that Sarah Day, now Sarah Sinclair, had been the actual criminal. The story generated significant attention. Thomas Day was exonerated publicly, and the company was forced to acknowledge that a miscarriage of justice had occurred. But the story also attempted to implicate Sarah. Margaret Collins reported that Sarah had been involved in the original theft, that she had opened accounts under a false name, and that she had later stolen money from her second husband, Robert Sinclair. Margaret quoted Robert as saying, "I believed I had married a woman who had experienced tragedy. I didn't realize I had married a woman who had orchestrated tragedy." Sarah's response to this publicity was remarkable. Instead of disappearing or denying the allegations, she hired a lawyer and threatened to sue Margaret Collins and the newspaper for libel. She released a statement saying that she was the victim of a conspiracy to discredit her, that the allegations against her were entirely false, and that she had been targeted because she had testified against her first husband. She said the auditors were wrong about the documents. She said Robert Sinclair was lying to avoid his own financial mismanagement. She said Margaret Collins was publishing false accusations to sell newspapers. The newspaper, unable to prove the allegations beyond doubt, issued a retraction. Margaret's story had been based on circumstantial evidence, on the word of unreliable witnesses, and on document examination that wasn't definitive enough to satisfy a legal burden of proof. The handwriting analysis suggested that the signatures weren't Thomas's, but it didn't definitively prove they were Sarah's. The bank accounts suggested suspicious financial activity, but they didn't constitute legal proof that Sarah had committed a crime. Sarah sued the newspaper for $100,000 in damages. The case was settled out of court for $25,000, which Sarah donated to a women's charity, thereby positioning herself as a victim who was magnanimous enough to forgive her slanderers. What happened next was that the story disappeared. It didn't become a major case because there was no way to prosecute it. Sarah had never been formally charged with a crime. The statute of limitations on the original Hartley supply theft had passed. The company had settled quietly. There was no legal mechanism by which Sarah could be held accountable for what she had done. But the story had planted seeds. People began to wonder. Robert Sinclair spent the rest of his life believing that Sarah had stolen from him, even though he could never prove it. Thomas Day finally understood what had happened to him, even though he could never recover what had been taken. Margaret Collins continued to investigate Sarah, but she found that as Sarah moved into older age, The story became less and less interesting to readers. Sarah continued to live comfortably on the money she had stolen. She changed her name again. She married a third time, to a man named Douglas Fletcher, a widower in his 70s who had a significant estate. She married him, managed his finances, positioned herself as the beneficiary in his will, and then waited for him to die. When he died in 1977, Sarah inherited $400,000. She was 55 years old. She had accumulated more wealth than she had ever dreamed of. She had destroyed at least 2 men's lives, and she had faced no legal consequences. She had committed the perfect crime because the crime had been invisible, and the criminal had positioned herself as something other than what she was. The only person who truly understood what had happened was Thomas. And what had he learned? He had learned that the truth is not always enough. He had learned that credibility matters more than facts. He had learned that the person closest to you can be a stranger. He had learned that the legal system can fail you even when you're innocent. He had learned that revenge is not worth anything because it can never restore what has been taken. And he had learned something else. He had learned that capacity for deception doesn't require evil. It requires intelligence, need, and the ability to justify your actions to yourself. Sarah was not a monster. She was a woman who had been trapped and had chosen to escape in the most destructive way possible. She was a woman who had prioritized her own freedom over someone else's, and she had been willing to destroy an innocent man to achieve that freedom. What does the story of Sarah Day reveal about us? What does it tell us about the systems we've built to protect the innocent and punish the guilty? What does it tell us about the nature of deception and about our vulnerability to it? The first thing Sarah's story reveals is that credibility is more powerful than evidence. In the trial of Thomas Day, the jury had to choose between 2 sources of information: the documented evidence of the crime and the testimony of a witness. The documented evidence was real, solid, and unchanging, but the testimony came from a woman whose credibility seemed unquestionable, a woman who was testifying against her own husband, a woman who was betraying someone she loved, a woman who had every reason to protect her husband and yet had chosen to do what was right. This is why Sarah's crime was so successful. She understood that the legal system privileges personal testimony from credible witnesses above almost everything else. She understood that a wife's testimony about her husband's confession is considered intimate knowledge, something only she would know. She understood that a woman who testified against her own husband would be believed because she was going against her own interests. And she was absolutely correct about all of this. The second thing Sarah's story reveals is that our legal system has a particular blind spot regarding perpetrators who are positioned as victims. The system is designed to protect innocent people from being accused of crimes they didn't commit, but it is not designed to protect innocent people from being accused by people who appear to be victims. When the accuser is sympathetic, when she has a story of betrayal and loss, the system assumes her credibility and protects her. This is why Sarah was never prosecuted. By the time the evidence emerged, suggesting she was the actual criminal, she was no longer the accused. She was no longer in the position of having to defend herself. She was in the position of having the system defend her. The legal machinery that had been turned against Thomas so effectively had no mechanism to turn against Sarah because Sarah had never been the defendant. The third thing Sarah's story reveals is something about the psychology of deception itself. Sarah didn't lie the way most people lie. Most lies are reactive. They're told in response to a threat or a challenge. But Sarah's lies were proactive. She constructed an entire false narrative long before anyone questioned her. She built the evidence, she created the witnesses, and she positioned herself as the discoverer of the crime rather than the perpetrator of it. This suggests something unsettling about the nature of sophisticated deception. It requires not just dishonesty, but imagination. It requires the ability to construct an alternative version of reality so complete that it becomes indistinguishable from truth. It requires the ability to inhabit that alternative reality so completely that you begin to believe it. It requires, in short, the same creativity and intelligence that we typically associate with virtue. This is why Sarah is neither a monster nor a villain in the conventional sense. She is a woman who used intelligence, planning, and psychological insight to escape a situation she found intolerable. That she chose to escape in a way that destroyed an innocent person is significant, yes, but it's not because she was fundamentally evil. It's because she had convinced herself that her freedom was more important than his, and that his suffering was an acceptable cost for her liberation. The fourth thing Sarah's story reveals is something about the relationship between autonomy and harm. Sarah's primary motivation wasn't greed. She wasn't seeking to become wealthy, or at least, that wasn't the primary driver. Her primary motivation was autonomy. She wanted to escape from the position of dependence that her marriage represented. She wanted to be free from male control. She wanted to be able to make her own decisions without asking permission. These are legitimate desires. These are human desires. And yet she pursued them in a way that required destroying someone else. This is the central moral tension of Sarah's story. It's possible to sympathize with her need for freedom without condoning her method of achieving it. It's possible to understand why she did what she did without believing that what she did was justified. And it's possible to recognize that the legal system had failed to give her legitimate avenues for achieving her freedom, and that this failure contributed to her decision to pursue freedom through deception and betrayal. The fifth thing Sarah's story reveals is the relative invisibility of female perpetrators. We have constructed narratives about crime that tend to center on male perpetrators. We have built mental images of criminals that feature men who are aggressive, violent, controlling, and destructive. When we encounter a woman who is intelligent and composed, who expresses sadness about what has happened, who is willing to testify against someone even though it costs her something, we tend to believe her. We tend to trust her. We tend to see her as a victim rather than as a perpetrator. Sarah understood this completely. She understood that a woman committing white-collar crime was almost invisible because we don't have the right mental models for it. She understood that she could hide in plain sight, that she could position herself as exactly the kind of woman the system wanted to believe in. And she was right. The sixth thing Sarah's story reveals is something about the particular vulnerability of people who love us. Thomas was not stupid. He was not naive. He was an educated man, an engineer, someone who worked with systems and precision. But he was in love with his wife, and that love made him vulnerable to her deception in a way that nothing else could have. Because to truly trust someone requires a kind of psychological openness that makes you vulnerable to betrayal by that person. This is one of the deepest paradoxes of human relationships. The closer you are to someone, the more damaged you can be by their deception. The people who can hurt you most are not your enemies. They are your loved ones. And the people who can orchestrate the most sophisticated deceptions are not strangers. They are people who have studied you, who understand your vulnerabilities, who know exactly what you need to hear and believe. Thomas loved Sarah, and this love made him assume her credibility. This love made him believe her testimony. This love made him unable to imagine that she could be deceiving him on such a fundamental level. And this love, ultimately, made him a victim of the one person he should have been able to trust completely. The seventh thing Sarah's story reveals is the problem of redemption after the moment has passed. By the time the truth about Sarah emerged, Thomas had already served his sentence. The legal system couldn't restore the 3 years he had lost. It couldn't restore his career, his reputation, his peace of mind. It could only exonerate him, which is something very different from restoring what had been taken. Sarah, on the other hand, faced no legal consequences. She had already secured her freedom, already accumulated her wealth, already moved on to the next phase of her life. The exposure of what she had done didn't destroy her because she was no longer vulnerable to the legal system in the way she had been before. She could sue for libel. She could hire lawyers. She could position herself as a victim of false accusation. She was powerful now in a way that the vulnerable, imprisoned Thomas had never been. This asymmetry, this fact that Thomas paid the price for Sarah's crime, while Sarah faced no legal consequences, is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of her story, because it suggests that the legal system doesn't protect the innocent as much as we like to believe it does. It suggests that credibility, positioning, and psychological manipulation can be more powerful than evidence. It suggests that sometimes the person who is most skillful at creating the narrative of victimhood is the one who actually escapes. And finally, Sarah's story reveals something about our own vulnerability. As you listen to this story, you likely ask yourself, could this happen to me? Could I be deceived by someone I love? Could I be convicted of a crime I didn't commit? Could I be positioned as the victim while the perpetrator escapes? The answer is yes. To all of these questions, the answer is yes. We like to believe that we are too intelligent to be deceived, that we are too careful to be manipulated, that we would see the signs if someone close to us was lying to us. But Sarah's story suggests something different. It suggests that the more intelligent you are, the more you can be deceived by someone equally intelligent who has a plan. It suggests that the more careful you are, the more convincing the deception needs to be. and therefore the more sophisticated it must be. It suggests that you might see all of the signs and still fail to recognize them as signs because they are being presented to you by someone whose credibility you don't question. The question that Sarah's story leaves us with is this: how do you trust someone while remaining open to the possibility that they are deceiving you? How do you love someone while staying vigilant to the possibility that your love is being exploited? How do you live in relationship with other people while acknowledging that those relationships contain within them the potential for extraordinary harm? There is no perfect answer to these questions. We cannot protect ourselves completely from the people we love without losing the ability to love them. We cannot remain open to deception without being vulnerable to it. We must trust, knowing that trust can be weaponized. We must love, knowing that love can be used against us. We must live in connection with others, knowing that connection is a kind of vulnerability. What Sarah Day understood, what she understood better than most people, is that this vulnerability is the foundation of everything. This vulnerability is why deception is possible. This vulnerability is why trust is powerful. This vulnerability is why the bond between people can be weaponized so effectively. The question is not how to eliminate this vulnerability. The question is how to live with it, how to acknowledge it, how to create systems and relationships that are robust enough to survive even when that vulnerability is betrayed. Thomas Day survived his betrayal. He was released from prison. He was exonerated. He lived out his life with the knowledge of what his wife had done, and he found a way to live with that knowledge. He didn't recover what was taken from him, but he survived. He endured. He remained human. Sarah Day also survived. She accumulated wealth. She married multiple times. She reconstructed her identity several times. She never faced legal consequences. She never experienced the kind of justice that victims deserve. She lived out her life knowing that she had done what she had done, and she found a way to live with that knowledge as well. The story of Sarah Day, then, is not a story about justice. It is a story about what happens when the systems we've built to protect the innocent fail, and what we can learn from that failure. It is a story about the vulnerability that is fundamental to human connection. It is a story about the gap between the truth of what happened and the narrative that gets believed. And it is a story about the unsettling reality that sometimes the person who tells the most convincing story about being a victim is the same person who orchestrated the crime. The final question that remains unanswered is this: could this happen to you?